and at the back of the ring, crudely but deeply cut into the thick gold, was a cross. It was a lover's ring, and Issa, I thought, had been clever to spot it. I took the ring and thought of Valerian wearing it through all the hurt years. Or maybe, I dared to hope, he had tried to revenge his pain on her reputation by cutting a false cross into the ring, so that men would think he had been her lover. Arthur must never know, I warned Issa. And then I hurled the heavy ring into the river. "What was that?" Sagramor asked as I rejoined him. "Nothing," I said. "Nothing. Just a charm that might have brought us ill luck." Then a ram's horn sounded across the river, and I was spared the need to think about the ring's message. The enemy was coming. The bards still sing of that battle, though the gods only know how they invent the details they embroider into the tale, because to hear their songs you would think none of us could have survived Lugvale, and maybe none of us should. It was desperate. It was also, though the bards do not admit as much, a defeat for Arthur. Gorfithid's first attack was a howling rush of maddened spearmen who charged into the ford. Sagramor ordered us forward, and we met them in the river, where the clash of the shields was like a crack of thunder exploding in the valley's mouth. The enemy had the advantage of numbers, but their attack was channeled by the ford's margins, and we could afford to bring men from our flanks to thicken our centre. We in the front rank had time to thrust once, then we crouched behind our shields and simply shoved at the enemy line, while the men in our second rank fought across our heads. The ring of sword blades and clatter of shield bosses and clashing of spear shafts was deafening. But remarkably few men died, for it is hard to kill in the crush as two locked shield walls grind against each other. Instead, it becomes a pushing match. The enemy grasps your spearhead so you cannot pull it back. There is hardly room to draw a sword, and all the time the enemy's second rank are raining sword, axe, and spear blows on helmets and shield edges. The worst injuries are caused by men thrusting blades beneath the shields, and gradually a barrier of crippled men builds at the front to make the slaughter even more difficult. Only when one side pulls back can the other then kill the crippled enemies stranded at the battle's tide line. We prevailed on that first attack, not so much out of valour, but because Morfans pushed his 6 horsemen through the crush of our men and used his long horse spears to thrust down on the crouching enemy front line. "Shields! Shields!" I heard Morfan shouting, as the 6 horses' vast weight buckled our shield line forward. Our rear-rank men hoisted their shields high to protect the big war horses from the rain of enemy spears, while we in the front rank crouched in the river and tried to finish off the men who recoiled from the horsemen's thrusts. I sheltered behind Arthur's polished shield and stabbed with Howlbane whenever a gap offered in the enemy's line. I took 2 mighty blows to the head, but the helmet cushioned both, even if my skull did ring for an hour afterwards. One spear struck my scale armour, but could not pierce it. The man who launched that spear lunge was killed by Morfans, and after his death the enemy lost heart and splashed back to the river's northern bank. They took their wounded, all but a handful, who were too close to our line, and that handful we killed before we retreated to our own bank. We had lost 6 men to the other world, and twice that many to wounds. "You shouldn't be in the front line," Sagramor told me, as he watched our wounded being carried away. "They'll see you're not Arthur." "They're seeing that Arthur fights," I said, "unlike Gorfithid or Gunlius." The enemy kings had been close to the fight, but never close enough to use their weapons. Eorwith and Tanaburs were screaming at Gorfithid's men, encouraging them to the slaughter and promising them the rewards of the gods. But while Gorfithid reorganized his spearmen, a group of masterless men waded the river to attack on their own. Such warriors relied on a display of bravery to bring them riches and rank, and these 30 desperate men charged in a screaming rage once they were through the deepest part of the river. They were either drunk or battle-mad, for 30 alone attacked our whole force. The reward for their success would have been land, gold, forgiveness of their crimes, and lordly status in Gorfithid's court. But 30 men were not enough. They hurt us, but died doing it. They were all fine spearmen with shield hands thick with warrior rings, but each now faced 3 or 4 enemies. A whole group rushed towards me, seeing in my armour and white plume the fastest route to glory. But Sagramor and my wolf-tailed spearmen met and matched them. One huge man was wielding a Saxon axe. Sagramor killed him with his dark-curved blade, then plucked the axe from the dying hand and hurled it at another spearman, and all the while he was chanting his own weird battle song in his native tongue. A last swordsman attacked me, and I parried his scything blow with the iron boss of Arthur's shield, knocked his own shield aside with Howlbane, then kicked him in the groin. He doubled over, too hurt to cry out, and Issa rammed a spear into his neck. We stripped the dead attackers of their armour, their weapons and their jewellery, and left their bodies at the ford's edge as a barrier to the next attack. That attack came soon, and came hard. Like the first, this third assault was made by a mass of spearmen, only this time we met them at the near river bank, where the press of men behind the enemy's front rank forced their leading spearmen to stumble on the piled bodies. Their stumbling opened them to our counterattack, and we shouted in triumph as we slashed our red spears forward. Then the shields cracked together again, dying men screamed and called on their gods, and the swords rang loud as the anvils in Magnus. I was again in the front rank, crammed so close to the enemy line that I could smell the mead on their breath. One man tried to snatch the helmet from my head, and lost his hand to a sword stroke. The pushing match started again, and again it seemed that the enemy must force us back by sheer weight. But again Morfans brought his heavy horses through the crush, and again the enemy hurled spears that clattered on our shields, and once again Morfan's men thrust down with their long horsemen's spears, and once again the enemy pulled back. The bards say the river ran red, which is not true, though I did see tendrils of blood fading downstream from the wounded who tried and failed to get back through the ford. "We could fight the bastards here all day," Morfan said. His horse was bleeding, and he had dismounted to treat the animal's wound. I shook my head. "There's another ford upriver." I pointed westwards. "They'll have spearmen on this bank soon enough." Those outflanking enemy came sooner than I thought. For 10 minutes later, a shout from our left flank warned us that a group of enemy had indeed crossed the river to the west, and was now advancing along our bank. "Time to go back," Sagramor told me. His clean-shaven black face was smeared with blood and sweat, but there was joy in his eyes, for this was proving to be a fight that would make the poet struggle for new words to describe a battle, a fight that men would remember in smoky halls for winters to come, a fight that, even lost, would send a man in honour to the warrior halls of the other world. "Time to draw them in," Sagramor said, then shouted the order to withdraw, so that slowly and cumbersomely our whole force retreated past the village with its Roman building and stopped 100 paces beyond. Our left flank was now anchored on the Vale's steep western side, while our right was protected by the marshy ground that stretched towards the river. Even so, we were much more vulnerable than we had been at the ford, for our shield wall was now desperately thin, and the enemy could attack all along its length. It took Gorfithid a whole hour to bring his men across the river and array them in a new shield line. I guessed it was already afternoon, and I glanced behind me for some sign of Galahad or Tudric's men, but I saw no one approaching. Nor, I was glad to see, were there any men on the western hill, where Nemui's ghost fence guarded our flank. But Gorfithid hardly needed men there, for his army was now bigger than ever. New contingents had come from Branaginium, and Gorfithid's commanders were tugging and shoving those newcomers into the shield wall. We watched the captains using their long spears to straighten the enemy's line, and all of us, despite the defiance we shouted, knew that for every man we had killed at the river, 10 more had come across the ford. "We'll never hold them here," Sagramor said, as he watched the enemy forces grow. "We'll have to go back to the Treefeds." But then, before Sagramor could give the order to retreat, Gorfithid himself rode forward to challenge us. He came alone, without even his son, and he came with just a sheathed sword and a spear, for he had no arm to hold a shield. Gorfithid's gold-trimmed helmet, that Arthur had returned the week of his betrothal to Cynwen, was crowned with the spread wings of a golden eagle, and his black cloak was spread across his horse's rump. Sagramor growled at me to stay where I was, and strode forward to meet the king. Gorfithid used no reins, but spoke to his horse that obediently stopped 2 paces away from Sagramor. Gorfithid rested his spear butt on the ground, then forced his helmet's cheek-pieces aside so that his sour face showed. "You're Arthur's black demon," he accused Sagramor, spitting to avert any evil. "And your whore-loving lord shelters behind your sword." Gorfithid spat again, this time towards me. "Why don't you talk to me, Arthur?" he shouted. "Lost your tongue?" "My lord Arthur," Sagramor answered in his heavily accented British, "is saving his breath to sing his victory song." Gorfithid hefted his long spear. "I'm one-handed," he shouted at me, "but I'll fight you." I said nothing, nor did I move. Arthur, I knew, would never fight in single battle against a crippled man, though Arthur would never have stayed silent either. By now he would have been pleading with Gorfithid for peace. Gorfithid did not want peace. He wanted slaughter. He rode up and down our line, controlling his horse with his knees and shouting at our men. "You are dying because your lord can't keep his hands off a whore. You're dying for a bitch with a wet rump, for a bitch in perpetual heat. Your souls will be cursed. My dead are already feasting in the other world, but your souls will become their throw pieces. And why will you die? For his red-headed whore?" He pointed his spear at me, then rode his horse directly at me. I pulled back lest he saw through the helmet's eye-slit that I was not Arthur, and my spearmen closed protectively around me. Gorfithid laughed at my apparent timidity. His horse was close enough for my men to touch, but Gorfithid showed no fear of their spears as he spat at me. "Woman!" he called out, his worst insult, then touched his horse with his left foot, and the beast turned and galloped back towards his army. Sagramor turned to us and raised his arms. "Back!" he shouted. "Back to the fence! Quick now! Back!" We turned our backs on the enemy and hurried away, and a great shout went up as they saw our twin banners retreat. They thought we were running, and they broke their ranks to pursue us, but we had too great a start on them, and we had streamed through the gap in the barricade long before any of Gorfithid's men could reach us. Our line spread behind the fence, while I took Arthur's proper place in the very centre of the line, where the road ran through the empty gap between the felled trees. We deliberately left the gap without any obstacles in the hope that it would draw Gorfithid's attacks, and thus give our flanks time to rest. I raised Arthur's 2 banners there, and waited for the assault. Gorfithid roared at his disordered spearmen to make a new shield wall. King Gundlius commanded the enemy's right flank, and Prince Kynaglas the left. That arrangement suggested that Gorfithid was not going to take our bait of the open gap, but intended to assault all along the line. "You stay here!" Sagramor shouted at our spearmen. "You're warriors! You're going to prove it now! You stay here! You kill here! And you win here!" Morfans had forced his wounded horse a small way up the western hill, from where he looked north up the vale, judging whether this was the moment to sound the horn and summon Arthur. But enemy reinforcements were still crossing the ford, and he came back without putting the silver to his lips. Gorfithid's horn sounded instead,